Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan at MSP. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 26th of September 2024. So Frontline update rather than my hits and losses video first today, because I did this mapping update last night. It's undoubtedly changed since then. It's a very dynamic frontline in a number of areas, particularly say Vuhledar and areas of Pokrovsk, and the maps will have changed. I did this probably about 14 hours plus ago. As an update, so there you go. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the screen, pause the video, and look at the key. We're going to go to Kursk first. So up here in this neck of the woods, we see that the Russians are pushing in a number of places. Ukrainians are themselves trying to push. There is claim that as the Russians are pushing now from the east towards the west, the Ukrainians are trying to make headway in the northern area, so there's this kind of push and shove, as well as Ukrainians still trying to gain some purchase in the Glushkovo region below the same river that comes up there, goes along here and goes up there. So that's that. We'll go to Radu Hosu, who is a Romanian analyst, to see what he says. Operation Kursk, the Russians continue their counteroffensive, striking on the western flank. So he's saying not just the eastern. We've seen the western flank actually be the area where the Russians have made the most gains back again. Snagost, remember the Ukrainians had control of Snagost and were knocking on the door of, where are you? Korenovo, sorry, up there. Now they've been pushed back in this area. So they've lost pretty much all of that area from what they gained. And the Ukrainians seem to be under pressure, as I was saying, from the east as well. But Hosu says that the Russians are continuing their counteroffensive strike on the western flank, managing to regain a few square kilometers almost daily. While the gains are small and likely come with heavy losses, they are making some progress. The Russians have very little chance of achieving their goal imposed by Putin within the set time frame, liberating the Kursk Oblast by October the 15th. The deadline was initially October the 1st, then October the 7th, Putin's birthday, and now October the 15th. So that, if true, tells you something. The Ukrainian armed forces, AFU, have only had partial success in their objective to divert Russian forces from their original goal, attacking positions in the Kursk pocket, to a Ukrainian-controlled objective, allocating resources to the Glushkovo attack vector. This has happened to some degree, but likely not to the extent that the Ukrainians had hoped. So they were hoping on diverting other Russian troops from around here over to this area. It does seem somewhat more positional than it was, not as dynamic, particularly as it was earlier on in this campaign up here. So yeah, interesting to see what the Ukrainians are going to do going forward. How much are they going to hold on to this area? Will it depend what the Russians are going to bring to bear in terms of trying to take that land back? Okay, going up to a source here. Grayskull says pro-Ukrainian channel reports that the Ukrainians, the AFU, have entered Veseloya. So here we have this mapper's interpretation of what is going on, and that is in the area here. Now, actually, Surat Maps has some gains for the Ukrainians just south of Veseloya. They are claimed to be fighting for that, entering into the southern outskirts, as according to this source. We'll see if that develops. And then if we go to the east a little bit, Andrew Perpetua's turned some of the grey zone in Medvedev here into Ukrainian-controlled land. Not a lot, just a little bit there, but it is a large area of grey zone otherwise. And as Surat Maps claims here, just south of Borky, I'm sure it was Borky. I'm sure you're in there somewhere, Borky. I think this is Borky there. So we have some Russian counterattack taking place as they are making gains there. So that is quite a large area of land, as according to Surat Maps, pushing the Ukrainians much further to the west. So that is what's going on in Kursk. It is somewhat dynamic in a few areas, but certainly calmed down a lot compared to what it was. Then we come across to Vovchansk. And actually, we're going to look at the ISW here. So the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, says geolocated footage shows that the Ukrainian forces have regained positions at the Vovchansk aggregate plant, as we knew, in central Vovchansk, and advance in northeastern Vovchansk from the direction of Turkey and Shkorsa and Sverdlova streets. Goodness. Russian mill bloggers largely acknowledge that the Ukrainian capture of the aggregate plant has taken place, but claim that Ukrainian forces were able to take the plant with relative ease because Russian forces withdrew from the area and because the plant was mostly destroyed in artillery and airstrikes. Russian military sources reported that the Ukrainian operation to capture the plant was a result of careful planning and took over a week. And there are reports that they are still clearing out that aggregates plant. It's a careful job to do that. Obviously, booby traps, mines, and whatnot. But as you can see, Surat Maps has finally admitted that the Russians are no longer in control of that area. However, there is imagery to suggest, I think I've got it for my other section, so I haven't got the link here for you, but there's imagery to suggest that the Russians are bombing this with carb 1,500 kilogram bombs are raining down on the aggregates plant, which is a kind of like, if we can't have it, you can't have it either approach, sort of scorched earth to a degree. But anyway, Russians not in control of that area, but they are indeed bombing the crap out of it, to put it like mildly. Okay, moving out. Fantastic. My map has just gone nuts. Right, now going to, it's just about got itself together, my map. Sometimes Google Earth just has some real issues. Okay, looking at the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea. Some gains here for the Russians. That should be a red pin there for Surat Maps, a dark red one. So Surat Maps has a slight gain for the Russians in a field there, getting very close to the Oskil River. And Andrew Perpetua has the Russians turning a couple of three different sort of tree line gully things into a whole rectangle there of control. So the Russians making these serious gains around Pischana, and that is definitely something the Ukrainians need to be watching out for. That's a major concern. Stelmakivka and the area around here, still no change there. The Russians having some success there previously, but trying to make more of the Makivka-Nevska sector, where the Russians have been making some gains fairly consistently over the last week or two. There was some claim, I was reading analysis that was like, if it wasn't for the Ukrainians doing sort of well over here and holding the Russians back in the Terny Torska region, then it would be a lot more difficult further to the north. So it's useful that the Ukrainians are putting up some resistance further to the south there. But you know, there are worrying areas in so many different parts of the front line. If we come to Bakhmut, some small, I say Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar really, some small gains as according to Surat Maps for the Russians, still on the eastern side of the canal, just north of Kalinivka, where they've been making the gains, pushing supposedly according to Surat Maps across the canal there. There is no agreement here with Andrew Perpetua. He still has that as grey zone rather than Russian control on the western side of the canal. But Kalinivka there, to the north of it is this Hyrivka that, according to Surat Maps, the Russians have now largely taken control of. No agreement yet from Andrew Perpetua. We'll see if that has changed. Might already have done in his latest mapping update. Still some really big differences between the mappers in the Ivanivska and Klishivka area there, as you can see. And then, luckily, at least in this mapping update, probably has changed in the last 16 hours or so. Toretsk and New York appear to be not stabilized. No changes, at least in the last 24 hours, but that's been a really tough place for the Ukrainians. If we go and look at the ISW, they say basically no changes in any of the areas I've just said particularly. No geolocated changes. Here we go, Toretsk in the Toretsk direction. Actually, they do have the Russians advancing along one of the streets there, but that'll no doubt be a little bit behind on where we already are, as is the case usually with the Institute for the Study of War. We are going to look at Pokrovsk, though. Pokrovsk is an issue. There are these small gains towards the Minoharad and Pokrovsk areas here for the Russians, just filling in some of the gaps here. Bit of a difference there between Andrew Perpetua and Surat maps. Andrew Perpetua still has Kryvyi Yar as a grey zone, as well as Krasny Yar and Mykolaiivka there, whereas Surat maps has that broadly under control of the Russians. It's definitely a challenge in this area. As John Helen says, Russians seem to have passed the fortifications on the Hrodivka, Mykolaiivka, Lysivka line, which is just where we're talking about there, pushing through in that direction, and there are some major trench lines in this area. So you can just see, according to him, coming up through that darker field and then taking a right turn just north of Mykolaiivka, which would be just up here, and turning right there. So this could be a major Ukrainian trench line, and it's important that there are no more gains for the Russians in this area. But you can see that tailings heap there, which has a trench, that same trench line we just talked about, comes down to that, and then there's another smaller trench shooting off from it the other side. Well, as according to both mappers, this area just here is under Russia control, but that trench line comes down in this direction. So there have been some complaints about the Ukrainian decisions in terms of building fortifications in this area. I think it's mainly this area, sort of building trench lines behind the brow of a hill, and not having a lot of sense in where they've been built. Don't know who was making those decisions. So those criticisms may well hold, and it could be that the hope that these major trench lines would hold might be a little bit too hopeful. But anyway, yeah, John Allen saying that there are still a few trenches before Myrnihorod, but that's not much. So, a couple of smaller trenches here. You've obviously got the tree lines and whatnot, and then a larger one just on the outskirts. But really, you're at it now. This is the fight going on. Hrodivka, it seems like the trenches are just outside the town, which is here. So this line, the front line at the moment, appears to be the major defensive lines for the Ukrainians. They get past that, the Russians, and then they're knocking on the door of Myrnihorod, and thus really Pokrovsk. So it's slightly worrying times there for the Ukrainians. Then when we come further to the south, Seledove, some claims that the Ukrainians would be pulling out there pretty soon. That's under a lot of pressure. No movement around there directly, but further to the south, there is some gains according to, again, Surat maps, as they've taken full control over Ukrainsk. Both mappers agree with that, and it's just about pushing further to the west and encircling Seledove. That would be a worry. And this whole larger pocket, which, it was always going to go, there's this big pocket in here that was pretty unsustainable for the Ukrainians to keep hold of. The Russians, as if you join these pins up of the same colour, that gives you the line of where Andrew Perpetua's Russian front line was, and that's moved to here, this blue line. Quite a big difference, though, between what he claims and what Surat maps has. So that's a good 3 kilometers worth of difference between those two front lines, two defensive lines of the Russians, or I should say offensive lines. That's where they robustly control and they're pushing forward from. So yes, Surat maps, on the other hand, had the line a little bit further forward and now moving even further forward for the Russians. Luckily, not too much change below there around Herivka. that sort of Mariinka direction. It's funny to talk about it as Mariinka when that is now much further to the east, a bit like talking about this as Avdiivka when Avdiivka's all the way back here. Look at that land that the Russians have taken since, we were talking about Avdiivka. That is now all coming on for 40 kilometers. And if we're looking at the depth of that land, now this is comparable to Kursk, isn't it? 26.5 kilometers, especially as Kursk Oblast or Kursk incursion of the Ukrainians is being chipped away at by the Russians. Okay, moving further to the south, we have the Russians making gains along that road connecting Konstantinivka down to Vuhledar. I shouldn't have done that. And that is worrying as the Ukrainians are just ceding some of this land. You've got, by the way, Karakova. In fact, we'll talk about Karakova. So before we go down to Vuhledar, this is Karakova, which is potentially one of the main objectives for the Russians. It's south of the Pokrovsk area, alongside this reservoir here, and west of Mariinka. This is what Radu Hosu talks about. In recent weeks, the Russians have made negligible advances towards Pokrovsk and Leningrad. That's by the trenches we're just talking about. The stalling of this offensive can be attributed to factors such as adequately manned defence lines, construction of new defence lines, the deployment of well-coordinated veteran brigades. Additionally, Russia has deliberately slowed its advance in this area to push the front toward Ukrainsk and Karakova. So Karakova will likely become a frequent topic in war news and analysis. It's a key defensive stronghold in the southern Donbass region, part of the defence complex built in 2014. Other important locations include Vuhledar, Avdiivka, Toretsk, Bakhmut, Solidar, Seversk, Popasna, Bilorivka, and Sloviansk-Kramatorsk. And we know what happened with them. Karakova is fortified with complex defences to the south, natural barriers, and Lake Vovcha in the northwest and northeast. While the battle for Karakova won't be easy for the Russians, they likely have enough manpower and equipment to eventually conquer this fortress town. So there's going to be a lot of talk about this. As mentioned, to the north, you've got the natural barrier of the lake there, the reservoir, and then further to the south, fortifications potentially there. So anyway, coming down to this road and Vuhledar, and really there is fighting in Vuhledar now. It could be that even by the time I'm talking to you, most of that is taken by the Russians. They are moving through from the Dachas to the southeast and up and into Vuhledar. There isn't much hope really for the Ukrainians in this area. You can see that the Russians have gradually enclosed the beleaguered town. It's been hammered by aviation and artillery. There's lots of footage of that. That's pretty. It's going to be pretty challenging for the Ukrainians. Lots of analysis have been done. One from Emil Kestelhamy the other day. I'm not really going to go into this because it's probably a little bit outdated. It's footage of what you can see, but interesting images that give you a sense of the town. I showed you this the other day from a news piece, and this is where the Russians are pushing in from this direction, and you've got the same kind of level behind it. It goes downhill from here, and that allowed the Ukrainians to hold on to Vuhledar using the terrain quite effectively. As Castelhamy said the other day, the Battle of Vuhledar may be nearing its end soon, as the most of the recent developments are very concerning for the Ukrainians. There are not many fields the Russians need to capture in order to force the Ukrainians to retreat from the city, and the terrain in the area is flat behind, so there are no decisive natural obstacles which could help the defender. The main supply road is within FPV range. Counterattack could solve the situation, but it's unlikely to happen as the Ukrainians are already stretched too thin, really. And looking at the map, there's quite a good indicator of, so that tells you where they're coming from. The Dacha area here, coming up into that area of the main town. But this map here gives you a sense of what's going on. So using that same picture, here's another map I made showing the gravity of the situation for Ukraine in Vuhledar. So it's AMK mapping. Now these green lines are the roads out of there, right? So this is how you get out of Vuhledar if you are a Ukrainian. However, these green roads go into the blue area, which is grey zone. So in order to get out using the roads, you are going through the grey zone, and the Russian control area in red there. So it is really going to be really challenging for any troops left in Vuhledar to get out without having to go basically cross country and try and get through that central channel. I mean, it's got to be a case of getting out of Dodge as soon as possible to protect as many people as possible. He also says, Russian forces are reportedly advancing Vuhledar, capturing 8 more high-rise buildings. This, if true, would put them right outside the House of Culture in the town centre, he says. So, fighting right in the centre of Vuhledar now. I mean, it's for sure, it's game over, isn't it? And yeah, so that's what's going on there. I mean, it's not a huge place, Vuhledar, to be honest. It has those, so we go back to my map, and typically that has gone nuts. Yeah, so the dachas are pretty much, bigger than the size of the main town of Vuhledar. It's just, it's game over there, isn't it? So we'll keep an eye on that one, obviously. Some tiny gains for the Russians, like the odd field north of Staromyrsk and to the west of Staromyrsk there in the Velika Novosilka sector, but otherwise nothing too much to report of. The Russians do seem to be pushing on. I keep saying, how long can they keep going on for? This is unsustainable, but it has been unsustainable, but then they change the way that you view sustainability. I always think of the Russians as like a conventional armed forces that have this many resources and this much material and personnel, etc., etc. And they throw all this at the Ukrainians. Ukrainians do a really good job of attriting those forces. And you think, God, they can't keep going on. But then they still throw humans and material at the problem. And that's because they're scrabbling around Russia, picking up whoever they can, convicts, people on trial, people from abroad, people from the occupied territories. And then you're starting to hear rumors that the Chinese, I often talk in terms of all things remaining equal, this is what would happen. But all things don't remain equal. It's dynamic, and what the Russians are able to do is pull on. If China can help out Russia, then that is a big game changer. And if they are starting to help out with military equipment, such as armoured vehicles on the front line, as we have seen some hints thereof, that is really challenging for the Ukrainians, because I think the Russians are on the cusp here of culminating, of not being able to do an awful lot more. But if they get that Chinese help, then that could possibly change things in serious ways. But we'll see. It's a case of Russia just throwing everything they can to keep perpetuating these gains that they are making in certain areas of Frontline. And then they do it in other places like Pischany and Makivka Nevska. They seem to struggle to do anything meaningful around Chasiv Yar for some time, so that's good news. And yeah, obviously Karakova. It's interesting to wonder whether the Russians would have the resources to be able to properly push on Karakova. And I keep saying stuff like that, and then you look at the amount of land that they have actually taken in Pokros. So worrying for the Ukrainians. But on a larger scheme of things, like if we do properly hear news today of the $8 billion of aid from the US to Ukraine, the rest of the PDA, Presidential Drawdown Authority, and USAI, if other nations continue to help, as hopefully they will, then the Russians are going to be in an ever more precarious position themselves. So on the macro front, it's still the case that Ukraine, I'd rather be Ukraine than Russia type thing. But on a micro scale, the Russians are definitely giving the Ukrainians some serious concerns. Let me know what you guys think. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.